Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming. And thanks to the Army War College and the Cumberland chapter of the Association of the United States Army for including me in the Great Decisions lecture series. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Energy independence is certainly a timely issue for a series like this, but it's not at all a new issue. Politicians and policymakers have been talking about energy independence for 40 years, ever since the United States became a net oil importer in the early 1970s, also around the time of the first major world oil crisis. Now, politicians and policymakers have rarely been precise or analytically rigorous in their use of the term energy independence, but at least in its most ambitious formulation, it seems to mean that the United States would never again have to import hydrocarbon molecules, whether in liquid form as crude oil or in gaseous form as natural gas. In a somewhat less ambitious, but still pretty ambitious version, energy independence means that America's need to import hydrocarbons is significantly reduced to a point where it can be met with imports exclusively from friendly neighbors, Canada and Mexico, rather than from countries that may be geopolitically at odds with the United States. I should say at the outset that I am deeply skeptical about the feasibility of energy independence. I'm even more skeptical about its desirability. That is, I recognize, somewhat contrarian view, so let me expound on it for a moment. The opposite of energy independence is not energy dependence, it's energy interdependence. And since World War II, stabilizing energy interdependence has been an absolutely critical element in American grand strategy and in America's standing as a great power. For decades, America's interest in stabilizing energy interdependence has been embodied in its commitment to defend the free flow of Persian Gulf hydrocarbons to international markets. In this regard, it's crucial to understand that the U.S. interest in Persian Gulf oil from its origins in World War II was never fundamentally or primarily about Persian Gulf oil to meet America's own energy consumption needs. The United States came out of World War II self-sufficient and then some in oil production. It was, by the definitions I laid out above, energy independent. It had not only provided all the oil it used in prosecuting World War II, it had provided virtually all of the oil its allies had used. The United States would not become a net oil importer until, as I noted, the early 1970s, more than a quarter century after the Second World War ended. And even after becoming a net importer, the United States has never met that high a percentage of its own oil demand with imports from the Persian Gulf. This is important. America's interest in the Persian Gulf has never been about Persian Gulf oil to satisfy its own energy demand. It's been, in its origins, about stabilizing energy interdependence by controlling who gets access to Persian Gulf oil. Coming out of World War II, America wanted to provide secure flows of Persian Gulf oil to Western Europe and Japan, because U.S. policymakers judged that the provision of secure and reasonably priced energy supplies to these states would be essential to their post-war recovery. And their recovery was seen as essential to America's own long-term economic prospects. More broadly, U.S. provided energy security would help lock Western Europe and Japan into long-term economic and security partnerships with the United States. For nearly 70 years, this has remained the real foundation of America's interest in maintaining strategic influence over the production and marketing of Persian Gulf hydrocarbons to bolster America's strategic standing in other important parts of the world.
Sir, what
Yes.
are you defining as Persian Gulf oil? Is that Saudi oil too?
It includes Saudi oil. Yeah. Over the past 40 years, American discourse about energy independence has implied, I think, an increasing antipathy to the idea of energy interdependence. And in that sense, I think that the ideology of energy independence doesn't make America stronger. It actually reduces the tools available to policymakers to promote American interests around the world. Furthermore, it reinforces an already dangerous illusion that the United States doesn't have to engage in serious diplomacy with strategic rivals. I don't think those are positive things. I'm going to proceed in 4 stages with you today. First, I'm going to talk about the concept of energy independence and how it's evolved over the last 40 years. Second, I'm going to talk about the so-called Shale Revolution and how that has affected American discourse about energy independence. Third, I'm going to talk about how the Shale Revolution, in my view, has been overblown in terms of its strategic impact. And finally, I'll talk in greater depth about the negative impact of energy independence on U.S. foreign policy. Over the past 40 years, the thinking of American elites about how energy independence can be achieved has evolved significantly. Until relatively recently, politicians and policymakers have talked about energy independence largely in terms of replacing hydrocarbons with alternative forms of energy and/or in terms of demand management. Traditional versions of energy independence are rooted in a sense that there is something irrational about the contemporary world's reliance on hydrocarbons for at least 80% of its energy. Traditional versions of energy independence treat that reliance as pathological, as an addiction that needs treatment. In fact, the world's reliance on hydrocarbons for the bulk of its energy is perfectly rational. Hydrocarbons are high-density, efficient fuels. Their energy per unit is very high, and especially in their liquid form, they are cheaper to transport and store than just about any other kind of fuel. Moreover, hydrocarbons themselves are incredibly cheap. A barrel of oil, the standard volumetric measure for crude oil, measures out at roughly 42 gallons. If you emptied one into an average bathtub, you would just about fill up the bathtub. Now, if you take a barrel of oil and compare its price to that of an equal volume of any other liquid you would care to choose, milk, Diet Coke, shampoo, even water, you would find that even over $100 per barrel, crude oil is the cheapest liquid on the planet. Let me say that again. Even at over $100 a barrel, crude oil is the cheapest liquid on the planet. Milk, water, Diet Coke, all more expensive than crude oil. A high-end French perfume, let's use Chanel No. 5 as the benchmark, is orders of magnitude more expensive than crude oil. Okay? As I said, hydrocarbons are incredibly cheap. This reality makes it hard to displace crude oil and other hydrocarbons. To shift to alternatives, they have to be able to provide the same level of energy as hydrocarbons in a way that's economically competitive, and to do it on an enormous scale. And so far, no non-hydrocarbon-based form of energy has come anywhere close to that. And that, as I said, makes me very skeptical about the feasibility of traditional versions of energy independence. But there's now a new element, new dimension to the discussion of energy independence in the United States. More specifically, discourse about energy independence has, in recent years, increasingly been driven by the proposition that the United States can produce enough oil and gas on its own to obviate the need to import hydrocarbons. The reigning conception today isn't about achieving energy independence by replacing hydrocarbons or reducing demand. It's about achieving energy independence by producing more hydrocarbons right here. For its proponents, this vision of energy independence enshrines it as a geopolitical game changer. This is the vision that has politicians and pundits talking about how America can use domestic oil and gas production to enhance not just its own energy security, but also by becoming an energy exporter again, that of its allies. This is the vision that has some talking about how America can pay less attention to the Middle East and focus more on Asia and a rising China. More assertively, this is the vision that has politicians and pundits talking about how America can leverage its heightened stature as an energy producer to weaken uncooperative hydrocarbon powers by taking away their markets, lowering energy prices, and by extension, by severely reducing their oil and gas revenues. These arguments have come to the fore in a lot of the recent discussion about how Washington should respond to the Ukraine crisis, with many commentators, including editorial boards at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, urging natural gas exports from America to Europe as a way of weakening Russia's strategic position. The list of uncooperative hydrocarbon powers that can supposedly be brought to heel by America's rebirth as an energy exporter doesn't stop with Russia. Former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon and others have been publicly proclaiming that expanding U.S. energy production was key to what they see as the quote-unquote success of sanctions in, again, quote-unquote, bringing Iran to the negotiating table regarding its nuclear activities. This is the vision of energy independence on which we're focusing today. And I will say up front that I'm also very skeptical about supply-based energy independence and the idea of America as strategically resurgent energy superpower. We'll come to the reasons for my skepticism about those propositions in due course. Now, the key to this supply-driven vision of energy independence has been the so-called Shale Revolution, brought about by the use of hydraulic fracturing or fracking in oil and gas production in the United States, including right here in Pennsylvania. Let me take a minute to talk about fracking so we're all on the same page about it. Literally, hydraulic fracturing is the fracturing of rock by pressurized liquid. In the oil and gas industry, fracking entails the integration of two different technologies. One is horizontal drilling, whereby an initially vertical, up and down drill hole is turned horizontally before it enters the underground target zone where hydrocarbons are actually located. The second technology involved in fracking is the injection of fracking fluid, typically a mix of water, sand, and various chemicals, at high pressure from points along the horizontal wellbore into the surrounding rock. Why is fracking so important? Most of the oil and gas that gets produced around the world, let's call it conventional oil and gas, is lifted from reservoirs made out of relatively porous and permeable sedimentary rock, usually either limestone or sandstone. Generally speaking, you don't need fracking to develop conventional hydrocarbon reserves. What fracking lets oil and gas producers do is to access hydrocarbon reserves that aren't in conventional reservoir rock, but are instead in very tight shale rock formations. Conventional drilling techniques can't access shale oil and shale gas, at least not in an economically viable way. The rock is just too tight. You can't recover enough of the oil and gas embedded in the shale rock to make it worthwhile. But if you apply fracking technology, if you apply horizontal drilling to shale rock formations, the injection of fracking fluid from horizontal wellbores into the surrounding rock creates fractures that free oil and gas molecules embedded in the rock to migrate to the wellbore. From there, they can be moved to the surface. Fracking technology has been around in the oil and gas industry since the 1940s. But it was only in the 1980s and 1990s that companies began to figure out how to apply it more efficiently and cheaply so that it could be used more widely in oil and gas production here in the United States. Their success has grounded the Shale Revolution in American energy over the last decade or so, and that revolution has had a substantial impact on U.S. energy production. In 2000, not all that long ago, especially in the energy business, shale accounted for just 2% of total U.S. gas production. In 2007, it still accounted for just 5% of U.S. gas production. But from 2007 to 2012, shale gas production in the United States grew by over 50%, 50% each year. As a result, by 2012, shale accounted for 37% of U.S. gas production, and that figure looks set to rise further. Many observers now claim that shale can make America self-sufficient and then some in natural gas for decades to come. Let's turn to oil. Conventional oil production from conventional reservoirs without applying fracking technology, conventional oil production peaked in the United States in 1970 at 9.7 million barrels per day. and then slowly but steadily declined, reaching a low of well under 5 million barrels per day in 2008. But between 2007 and 2012, shale oil production in the United States grew by a factor of 18. With shale coming online, overall oil production in the United States started growing again, and the pace of that growth is accelerating. The United States produced 7.5 million barrels per day of crude oil in 2013, making it the third largest oil producer in the world after Saudi Arabia and Russia. If you throw in natural gas liquids, U.S. liquid fuel production was at 11.1 million barrels per day last year, ahead of Russia, and less than 1 million barrels per day behind Saudi Arabia. This is having an appreciable impact on U.S. demand for imported oil. In 2005, imports accounted for 60% of liquid fuel demand in the United States. By 2011, this percentage had dropped to 45%. Preliminary data for 2013 suggests it may be down to 35%. Now, this is all good news as far as it goes. Over the last decade or so, energy imports have accounted for roughly half of America's massive trade deficit. To the extent that the United States has to import less oil or natural gas, that's clearly positive for the U.S. balance of payments, which definitely needs as much help as it can get. There's also a certain measure of job growth associated with the Shale Revolution, and because of that, some positive contribution to overall GDP growth as well. Nevertheless, as I said, I am personally skeptical about the Shale Revolution and the supply-driven vision of energy independence. I am skeptical about the Shale Revolution's scope and long-term sustainability for basically the same reasons I'm skeptical about traditional versions of energy independence: cost and scale. I'm also skeptical that even if supply-based energy independence can be achieved, that it will be as strategically empowering for the United States as some would say. Let's look first at scope and sustainability. The Shale Revolution's scope and sustainability need to be evaluated along a couple of different dimensions. One geological, the other focused on market sustainability and market impact. For gas, the picture seems pretty positive in geological terms. Everyone seems to think the United States has a lot of shale gas in rocks that can be productively developed by energy companies. But in terms of market sustainability, the industry runs the risk of being the victim of its own success. Companies have gotten very good at producing shale gas in the United States, but in the process, they've driven gas prices in North America so low, they're starting to worry about price points too low to justify continued investment in new production on the scale needed to keep the boom going. Right now, in fact, the big energy companies, the international super majors and majors that followed smaller independent companies, independent producers into the U.S. shale gas sector, those big energy companies are currently losing money on their investments in U.S. shale. It's not clear yet how this is going to shake out over the longer term, but it does raise questions about how much shale gas is actually going to be available for export in coming years. There are also enormous policy questions about how U.S. shale gas will be used. As I said, many observers claim that shale gas seems to hold the promise of making America self-sufficient and then some in gas. But what do you do with the then some. What do you do with whatever increment of shale gas production that's not used for power generation and heating here in the United States? There's a debate about this going on right now. On one side are those who want to export shale gas in the form of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. The US government has already issued a small number of export licenses for LNG trains that would use domestically produced shale gas, and export license applications are pending for over 20 additional LNG projects. On the other side of this debate are those who want to do what they argue are more value-adding things with shale gas. There is, for example, the petrochemical industry, which wants to use domestically produced shale gas as cheap feedstock to leverage relocation of petrochemical production back to the United States. So Dow Chemical and other companies are urging the US government not to give out, from their perspective, too many gas export licenses. There are other constituencies that want to expand the use of natural gas as a transportation fuel here in the United States, which they argue is more value-adding than exporting it. So even if prices stay high enough to incentivize continued investment in shale gas production, it's not clear how much US gas is actually going to be available for export in coming years. And there are other big issues at play here. To understand both why proponents of the transformative potential of American LNG are so focused on this prospect, and why this prospect is going to be very hard to realize, let's talk for a moment about international gas markets and how they are different in important ways from the international oil market. In contrast to oil, where there is basically a single global market, there is no single integrated market for natural gas. A lot of this stems from the infrastructure through which natural gas is marketed. For anything except very long, literally going across oceans kinds of marketing, natural gas is transported overwhelmingly through pipelines. Now, think about a pipeline. It starts at point A, near where the gas is produced, and it ends at point B, where the gas is bought and used by consumers. There's not a lot of flexibility in that arrangement. By contrast, if you have a tanker shipment of oil from Angola, and that shipment is originally intended to go to Europe, but for various reasons it seems more opportune to redirect it to China, that's a fairly easy thing to do. The ship plots a different course. You can't do that with pipelines. Fixed infrastructure pipelines mean that there isn't and really can't be a single integrated market for natural gas. In reality, there are three big regional markets, one in North America, one in Europe, and one in Asia. And as long as you're shipping gas through pipelines, it's hard to do any kind of arbitrage across these three markets because you can't easily move cargoes from one region to another. So in terms of pricing, these markets largely operate separately from one another. In 2012, for example, US gas prices averaged around $3 per million BTUs. In Germany, gas prices averaged around $11 per million BTUs, and in Japan, they were around $17 per million BTUs. Now that's quite a spread, okay? People have been saying, since the LNG industry got going, liquefied natural gas, that LNG, which is transported in huge ocean-going LNG carriers is going to create the possibility for a truly global market in natural gas. But LNG isn't big enough yet, and it hasn't gotten big enough in terms of actually creating a spot market for gas to make that much of a difference. A lot of the LNG that gets produced in the world is still wrapped up with long-term, the term of art is take or pay contracts, which means literally that, say, a Japanese buyer of LNG contracts with Qatar for a 20 or 25-year supply of LNG. The contract specifies what volumes of LNG Qatar will provide during that 20 or 25-year period. It specifies the pricing formula for the LNG. It also specifies that this is a take or pay contract. In other words, even if the Japanese buyer decides at some point that it could actually get gas cheaper somewhere else, or could generate energy more cheaply by doing something else, that Japanese buyer is committed for the length of the contract, whether he takes the LNG or not, to paying Qatar for it in the manner specified. The argument for this, the rationale, has been that the upfront costs of doing an LNG train are so high that without buyers committing to these long-term take-or-pay contracts, no one is going to put in the investment up front to build the train in the first place, unless energy companies and their financial backers know that they're going to be able to sell LNG from a train for 20 or 25 years, they won't do it. This has been the argument, anyway. Now, more and more LNG is starting to be available for spot transactions, which is creating more possibilities for arbitrage across these three regional markets. But until that gets a lot bigger, we're still talking effectively about three separate regional markets for natural gas. Proponents of U.S. LNG exports think that U.S. LNG volumes can help the spot market for gas turn the corner in terms of its size and help create a more integrated, truly global gas market. But growing U.S. LNG volumes to strategically significant levels is a daunting challenge. Recall what I just said about upfront costs. The first of the LNG trains for which the U.S. government has issued an export license is scheduled to come online next year, 2015. By the time this project starts operating, it will have cost at least $10 billion with a B, up front. The upfront costs for future LNG trains, which have yet to be built, will be at least that high, probably higher. Now, for how many LNG trains will U.S. producers be confident enough that they can sell sufficient LNG at a high enough price over what will undoubtedly be a long period of time, 20 or 25 years, to finance $10 billion or more up front? This is one of the reasons I suspect that most of the LNG projects for which U.S. gas producers have requested export licenses will never be built. Many of these producers are applying for the licenses to create perceptions of overseas demand for U.S. gas in the hope that this will push up current, very low gas prices in the North American market. And for those who seem to think that the United States could be exporting gas to Europe and the former Soviet Union in a matter of months, if only Washington would just issue more export licenses. It takes literally years to build an LNG train. Once you've taken the decision, once you've arranged the $10 billion plus in financing, once you've gotten the export license, then it takes literally years to build one. And let's assume we had a magic wand, we could wave it, and 3 new LNG projects would materialize in the United States tomorrow. Well, let's start sending that gas to Europe, to parts of the former Soviet Union. Let's show Putin a thing or two that way. All right, let's wave our magic wands. Okay? The volume from those 3 LNG trains is still going to be a fraction of the gas volumes that Russia exports to Europe and to former Soviet states. A fraction of that. There's also absolutely no guarantee that the owners of those LNG projects are going to want to sell to the European market. Remember what I said about the spread in gas prices. Prices are a lot higher in Europe than they are here, but they're higher still in Asia. And there are all kinds of Japanese buyers of LNG. You know, Osaka Power, Tokyo Power, all kinds of Japanese consumers of LNG who are coming to Washington on a regular basis to lobby the US government to say, you know, give these licenses so that US LNG can come to Japan. You know, even if 3 new LNG trains went online in the United States tomorrow, I don't think there's any particular likelihood that that LNG is going to go to European markets. The owners of those projects are going to sell that LNG to where they can get the biggest margins on it. And the Japanese are going to work very hard to make sure that American producers think that their biggest margins are going to be in Japan, not in Europe. With respect to the scope and sustainability of the current shale oil boom, there is a wider range of opinion in the industry about the outlook for shale oil production in the United States. Pretty much everyone agrees we will see higher levels of shale oil production, but on balance, there's more skepticism that you'll really get shale oil plays in the United States on the same scale as shale gas. Again, that's not to say you won't get more shale oil production, but you may not get it on the scale of the shale gas boom. You're probably not talking about shale making the United States much less self-sufficient, much less self-sufficient, and then some in oil. And in terms of policy issues, Washington hasn't even yet lifted its long-standing ban on U.S. crude oil exports. As for market impact, there's also a question of how significant America's shale oil boom will prove to be from a global perspective. The International Energy Agency is reasonably optimistic about shale oil production in the United States over the next 10 years or so. But you also have to take account of what's happening with conventional oil production in the United States. It's continuing to decline. Offshore Gulf of Mexico production is now declining. So to some degree, the increase in shale oil production gets eaten up, compensating for lost production in other arenas. That trend is going to accelerate after about 10 years, according to the International Energy Agency and other analytic sources. Thus, after about a decade or so, increased shale oil production doesn't translate into that big an increase in overall U.S. oil production. Put that in a global context, anticipating what global demand might be, and the International Energy Agency and others expect that from about 10 years out, the Middle East will continue to be, the Persian Gulf, will continue to be where the world looks for substantial incremental oil production over the long term. Now, let me come back to the impact of energy independence on U.S. foreign policy. As I said, the opposite of energy independence isn't energy dependence, it's energy interdependence. This means that there are no good consumers and bad consumers. There are no good producers or bad producers. There are only producers and consumers. But the ideology of energy independence tells American policymakers and politicians that the United States, as a matter of policy, can and should distinguish between good producers whose supply is to be welcomed and bad producers whose supply is to be kept out of the market to the greatest extent possible. Likewise, the ideology of energy independence tells American politicians and policymakers that the United States, as a matter of policy, can distinguish between good consumers whose energy needs are met through the market and bad consumers whose energy needs can be leveraged by restricting their access to the market. I think this is a very dangerous illusion. You see this illusion embodied in U.S. policy toward Iran. Iran has the world's third largest proven reserves of conventional crude oil after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. It has the world's second largest proven reserves of conventional natural gas after Russia. For many years now, U.S. policy has been that the world's third largest proven reserves of conventional crude oil and the world's second largest proven reserves of conventional natural gas should stay in the ground for reasons that have nothing to do with the global energy balance, but that those reserves should stay in the ground until Iran essentially surrenders to American demands on a number of other issues that, again, have nothing to do with the global energy balance. Okay? I think in terms of energy security, that is a truly irrational policy. In the introduction, my latest book was kindly mentioned. I can't resist pointing out it is easily available in paperback now. My publisher says I have to do that every place I go and speak, so I trained myself to bring the prop along. My wife and I, in this book, we argue that the United States, for its own interests, needs to come to terms with, realign relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran as thoroughly and comprehensively as it came to terms with and realigned relations with the People's Republic of China in the early 1970s. If you haven't noticed, America's strategic position in the Middle East is in free fall. It is in free fall to a large extent because of serious American policy mistakes. Self-inflicted blunders that have dissipated material aspects of American power for no meaningful strategic gain, and that have eviscerated the perceived legitimacy of American purposes in the Middle East for the vast majority of people who live in the Middle East. As a result of this, America's position in this strategically vital part of the world is, as I said, in free fall. I left my job as Senior Director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council at the White House in March of 2003, about 2 weeks before the balloon went up in Iraq. The timing of my departure was not coincidental. I thought then that the Iraq War was going to be a serious mistake, that projecting out 5 years, 10 years, I thought it would make the United States weaker. It would leave the United States less able to achieve its own stated high priority objectives in the Middle East. 11 years later, I am sorry to say, I have not seen anything that has persuaded me that that judgment was wrong. The U.S. position in the Middle East is in free fall, and it is in free fall largely because of mistakes that successive U.S. administrations have made, policy mistakes. To rectify that, one of the things I think the United States needs to do is come to terms with the most important rising regional power in the Middle East, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran. Think back to when President Nixon made his historic trip to China. For 20 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China, the United States had isolated it diplomatically, had tried to strangle it economically. We didn't just support regime change in China, we recognize this whole other political order based on Taiwan as the real government of China. And the result of that was disastrous for American interests. It undermined the U.S. position in Asia, got us into the draining quagmire of the Vietnam War. Nixon and Kissinger had the insight to realize that the United States needed to do something fundamentally different in Asia. It was going to have to come to terms with the rising regional power in Asia, namely the People's Republic of China. Their opening to China saved the American position in Asia and revived the image of America as a nation that could actually proactively shape positive strategic outcomes through strategically grounded diplomacy. We need that in the Middle East today, and the way to do that is not Nixon to China, but, as the title of our book says, going to Tehran. Okay? But the ideology of energy independence tells us we don't have to do that. The ideology of energy independence tells us we can actually try and keep Iranian oil and gas off the market. That's actually a good thing. It's not a good thing. It is destabilizing energy interdependence. If you want to understand what I'm talking about, look no further than the current crisis in Ukraine. The United States has, for decades, been encouraging Europeans to develop alternative sources of gas to Russia. And the Europeans, with American support, have tried various ways to develop, to get Central Asian hydrocarbons coming, across the Caspian through Turkey to Europe. And basically, none of these projects makes economic sense, which means that energy companies which are responsible to shareholders won't do them unless you have sufficient volumes of Iranian hydrocarbons committed to those projects. But because of our ideology of energy independence, we say Iran's a bad producer, we can't have their volumes coming in. And so basically there's been no progress at reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas, even though people have recognized the problem for 20 years and have been working on various ways to try and reduce that dependence for 20 years, unless you're willing to let Iranian oil and gas come into the European market. It does not work. Okay? If you want energy security, you have to stabilize energy interdependence. And the ideology of energy independence is actually getting in the way of doing that. It really struck me when the Ukraine crisis broke. Within a matter of a couple of days, it didn't take a lot of time, the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, and President Rouhani's chief of staff, Mr. Nahavandian, this very, very smart Western-trained economist, both of them came out and made public statements. Iran could be a reliable energy supplier to Europe. Okay? But the Europeans can't go there. The United States can't go there. That is an irrational policy. I think that it is also, the ideology of energy independence tells American policymakers that, well, yes, we can push back against Russia. We have these new energy weapons. But the reality is, as I've tried to explain, is we don't. We don't. The idea that we are ever going to be able to produce enough LNG here and export it at a cost that would undermine all of Russia's built-in advantages in consolidating and keeping its Eurasian energy markets is, to say the least, highly fanciful. But the ideology of energy independence lets us indulge that. I think it's also a very dangerous illusion that energy independence is going to let the United States pay less attention to the Persian Gulf. I think that is a very dangerous illusion. Remember what I said about the origins of the U.S. interest in Persian Gulf hydrocarbons. It's never been about Persian Gulf hydrocarbons to meet our energy consumption needs. It's about bolstering our strategic influence in other parts of the world because we're the great stabilizers of energy independence. This was really driven home to me when we were working on the Iran book, and I had a conversation with this very senior Japanese diplomat, someone who has devoted most of his very long and distinguished career to cultivating the closest possible U.S.-Japanese relationship. And we were talking about this whole issue of the U.S. as the provider of the global public good of energy security, and he said, you know, if the United States ever reached a point where it couldn't or wouldn't guarantee the flow of Persian Gulf hydrocarbons to Asian markets, it would lose its Asian allies, including Japan. That categorical, okay? You know, being a great power is hard work. You have to earn it. Now, maybe you could argue the United States really shouldn't try and be a great power in that way anymore. And, you know, I think there's a reasonable argument that can be made for that. It's not an argument I would endorse, but okay, reasonable argument can be made. But people who are advocating energy independence as a way of disengaging the Middle East ought at least to acknowledge that that is what they are advocating, that what they are advocating is that the United States should effectively remove itself from the great power business. Okay? By all means, you're free to advocate that. And I think that'll be a really interesting conversation, but you should at least acknowledge that that's what you're doing. Okay? I think that as I say, I think the American position in the Middle East is in free fall today largely because of our own mistakes. Because we've stopped being a kind of generator of public goods, and we've gotten wrapped up with the micromanagement of political outcomes. Things like regime change. And in that sense, U.S. foreign policy actually in some ways become a risk to global energy security. And one of the big reasons we wrote this book, I'll hold up the prop again, is to try and say, we can do this better. But I think at least the United States still needs to be playing that role for its own interest. Okay? And that is really probably the biggest reason I turn out to be an energy independence skeptic. I'll stop here, let you call the break, and then I look forward to the discussion after the break. Thank you. There's a guy over there.
Sir, that was a very good presentation, well-framed, comprehensive. If you presented that at an NSC meeting, what would the likely objections or rejoinders be to your response, and what would your response be to the rejoinders?
Okay. The question was, if I reprised the presentation I just gave to you, if I went back to the White House, went back to the National Security Council, and gave this presentation there, what would the reaction be? What would be the objections to some of the points that I made, and what would be my response or rejoinder to those objections? Part of the reaction would be denial. Denial because, and in this sense, I think the Obama administration is more deficient than some of its predecessors, in that I would say there's very, very little real-world expertise about the oil and gas industry in the Obama administration, even in the parts that basically focus on economic policy issues, and that gets worse in the parts of the administration that focus on foreign policy strategic issues. So there's just not really much of an appreciation of on-the-ground reality about the global energy scene. So since some of the facts that I try to put on the table are, can create cognitive dissonance, especially for people who don't know very much, I suspect a good deal of the initial reaction would be cognitive dissonance, and in my experience, human beings don't always deal immediately very well with cognitive dissonance. So I think there'd be a certain amount of denial. Some of the points on foreign policy, I think people in the administration would say that, but sanctions did work to get Iran to the table. And so, in that particular issue, that particular element of my argument, that's not correct. My response would be that it's simply not true that sanctions got Iran to the table. Iran has been willing to negotiate on its nuclear activities for more than a decade. The man who is the current president of the Islamic Republic, Hassan Rouhani, 10 years ago, he was the Secretary General of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. In that role, he was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator when Iran started negotiating with Western powers, initially Europeans, because the United States under the Bush administration wouldn't join in. And under Rouhani as the nuclear negotiator, Iran, get this, Iran suspended uranium enrichment for almost 2 years. The International Atomic Energy Agency certified that Iran had suspended enrichment, and they did so for nearly 2 years to facilitate negotiations with Western powers over their nuclear activities. In the end, the Europeans that they were negotiating with couldn't deliver the United States to the negotiating table, and the Europeans were unwilling to offer anything serious to Iran without the United States being there. And so, after nearly 2 years of suspending and getting nothing for it, the Iranians terminated their voluntary suspension. They were prepared at that point to reach an understanding with the Western powers, whereby they would have capped their centrifuge infrastructure at, I believe it was 2,000 centrifuges. We rejected that proposal. Today, Iran has 19,000 centrifuges, okay? About half of which are, actively processed and enrich uranium gas, okay? It is simply historically not true, not factually accurate that sanctions got the Iranians to the table. They were willing to be at the table more than 10 years ago. They were at the table. They did things that, the Iranians aren't going to suspend anymore. But, they suspended enrichment. If Iran suspended enrichment today, there'd be, people would be breaking out champagne and celebrating at the White House. Okay? Iran did that for 2 years, 10 years ago. And, that wasn't about sanctions. Even today, now that we're back, now that, the United States is willing at least to show up at the table, the basic negotiating approach of the Iranians hasn't changed. The basic model that Rouhani and Zarif and others have had in mind for years is greater transparency on Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for Western acceptance of Iran's sovereign right and its treaty-based right in the Non-Proliferation Treaty to enrich uranium under safeguards. Okay? That has been the model for a nuclear deal as far as the Iranians are concerned for more than 10 years. It's the model they're recommending now. We're the ones who are coming up, no, you've got to close down this facility and that facility, and you've got to dismantle 75% of your existing centrifuges, and even then, we're not really sure if we're prepared to let you enrich. And, the Iranians have been, I think, very consistent about their approach on the nuclear issue. And I would say it is not true that sanctions have done this. I think I would get pushed back on, that reducing the amount of oil that Iran could put on international markets is actually a bad idea. That we haven't had a dramatic spike in oil prices over the last couple of years as Iranian oil volumes coming onto international markets have shrunk. And to that I would say, you guys need a longer time frame, and you also need to brush up on basic microeconomics, okay? Part of the reason why you haven't, it's very hard to separate, but basically from the early 2000s until the financial crisis in 2008, oil prices were climbing pretty steadily. They peaked at over $140 a barrel in the summer of 2008. Then you had the global financial crisis, big reduction in energy demand around the world. Oil prices fell, but within a couple of years they started going back up. And, we're clearly back up and have been up for a long time in the $100 a barrel range. Now, you could say, well, by taking Iranian oil off the market, we didn't push prices back up to $140 a barrel. Yeah, but if you'd let Iranian oil come to the market, maybe prices would be at $80 a barrel. Okay? Is it really worth $20 a barrel, $15 to $20 a barrel, which is basically what people in the industry estimate that U.S. sanctions add to the price of oil around the world? I mean, you all are Americans and consumers and all of that. Do you like paying an extra $20 per barrel in oil for what I at least think is kind of a self-indulgent foreign policy? You know, I got better things to do with my money than that, as far as I'm concerned. I think that they, at the White House, they would also push back on the idea that oil is, and energy interdependence is central to American leadership, to America's standing as a great power. And my response to that is, in part, I didn't even tell you guys, I didn't even mention a really important part of this story, which is about, and I think we all have an interest in this, in the dollar maintaining its status as the world's leading reserve and transactional asset. Okay? Oil is absolutely critical to that. Let me tell you why. I think I've now gotten so old that if I ask my students this, they kind of look at me mystified. But I might get a response here, so I'm going to try. I'm going to try. How many of you remember this 1960s, you know, one of the classic early James Bond movies, Goldfinger? Okay, oh, great. Everybody's seen Goldfinger here. Love it. Okay. What's the premise of Goldfinger? Right. And why does Goldfinger steals this nuclear weapon, which he is going to smuggle into the gold vault at Fort Knox and set it off, irradiating the U.S. gold supply. Now, why does he want to do that? Yes, sir. Yes, because the U.S. was operating under a gold standard, meaning that foreign holders of dollars could show up at the Federal Reserve in New York and cash in their dollars for gold at a fixed ratio. If it ever reached a point where foreigners brought in more dollars than there was actually gold to cover, the U.S. was bankrupt. And this was actually getting to be a pressing issue in the 1960s because as more and more foreigners recovered from the war, started to, become economically sound again, they began to accumulate more and more, little green pictures of dead American presidents, and more of them were bringing them in to cash in for gold. And the U.S. was, reaching this point where we might run out of gold. And it was in this was the atmosphere in which the Goldfinger movie comes. Okay. But then in 1971, Richard Nixon just says, okay, we aren't converting dollars into gold anymore. But don't worry, the U.S. dollar is still backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Okay? All right. Okay. But the U.S. did a couple of, I have to admit, kind of clever things in the 1970s to try and kind of re-anchor the dollar without really saying that's what they were doing. In 1974, the then U.S. Treasury Secretary, William Simon, made a secret trip to Saudi Arabia in which he got the Saudis to agree to recycle much of their petrodollar surpluses through Western financial institutions. And, this is the really secret part, the Saudis agreed to put a certain significant chunk of their petrodollar surpluses into buying U.S. Treasury securities outside the normal auction process so that no one would really know. Okay? And so the U.S. could get its current account deficit covered with petrodollars. This was reinforced 4 years later when one of Mr. Simon's successors, Michael Blumenthal, President Carter's Secretary of the Treasury, went back to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal with the Saudis where the Saudis would use their influence in OPEC so that OPEC would denominate oil prices in dollars. And in fact, for many years, OPEC suppliers would not only denominate their prices in dollars, they would only accept dollars in payment. Okay? So you generate lots of demand for foreigners to hold on to, little green pictures of dead American presidents, because they need these to buy their oil, right? Okay, now, there's a little more flexibility in the system. The president of Saudi Aramco has told me directly, oh yeah, we'll accept payment in euros now, and in Japanese yen, and a couple other currencies. But yeah, we still denominate prices in dollars, which actually creates a much higher probability that those transactions are still going to get settled in dollars. Okay? So oil has become kind of what backs up the dollar, with all due respect to the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Okay, this is a really important prop. I don't really care what the Chinese do about these wretched little islands in the South China Sea. None of my Japanese friends are here to hear me say that, so I just say I don't really care about the Diaoyu or the Senkaku or whatever you want to call them, okay? I do notice when China strikes a deal with the United Arab Emirates, a major oil producer and exporter, so that $5.5 billion worth of Emirati oil that China is going to buy, the Emiratis will accept payment for it in the RMB, in the Chinese currency. That matters a whole lot more to the long-term U.S. strategic position than whatever China will do to those wretched little islands. Okay?
How much does ideology impact the relationship with Venezuela and with the Canadian tar sands and the XL pipeline?
My own read is that the politics of the Canadian pipeline, this is much more about kind of, the White House making decisions about what constituencies in the Democratic Party matter more than others. And so, not being prepared to move ahead with the Keystone pipeline. I think if you had, and I don't mean this as a partisan kind of statement, I think it's just analytically true. If you had a Republican administration making that decision, I think the odds would be vastly higher that Keystone would get approved, just because of, what constituencies Republican administrations tend to value compared to constituencies that Democratic administrations tend to value. So I think that has more to do with kind of U.S. domestic politics than ideology. In terms of U.S. relations with Venezuela, you know, I know a lot more about this in relation to Iran and China than I do about Venezuela. But one of the things that strikes me about American foreign policy in the modern period is that American administrations, and this cuts across party lines, don't deal, to my mind, they don't deal very well with countries that want to have a self-defined, independent foreign policy. You know? In a way, you could ask, how really anti-American can Venezuela be? I mean, the American market is a big deal for them. And, I don't want to, minimize the altruistic impact of, say, Citgo, giving out heating oil at subsidized rates to lower income American households in the Northeast. But I think a lot of the reason Citgo in Venezuela is doing that is basically to, counteract negative publicity about Venezuela and other fronts. I don't think Venezuela is really implacably or irrationally anti-American. I think they want to have an independent foreign policy. I'd say that about the Islamic Republic of Iran. Basically since World War II, the United States has never liked the idea of a really independent Iran. In 1951, well before the Iranian Revolution, in 1951, the Iranians elected a government under Mossadegh that wanted to reassert control over Iranian hydrocarbons and wanted to pursue an independent foreign policy. Mossadegh was not anti-American, but he wasn't prepared to completely subordinate Iranian foreign policy to American preferences. That wasn't good enough. And so in 1953, the CIA organizes a coup that overthrows the democratically elected government of Mossadegh. And I think a lot of the tension in the relationship with Venezuela stems from that. We have a sense of how, our partners are supposed to act in terms of their foreign policy, and the Venezuelans just, they ain't fitting in. Yes? Oh.
Okay. This is on. I was kind of looking for maybe a little clarification. You had talked about 3 markets, predominantly Europe, North America, and in Asia. Mm-hmm. Did I understand correctly that one of the reasons that we couldn't ever really force the Europeans or assist the Europeans in getting off of the Russian energy supplies and would mainly be because our private industry, in order to build a method for getting our natural gas to them, our private industry would prefer to go to greater margins in Asia. And is that the free market would keep us, is that what would prevent us from fully stocking Europe?
I think that if you look at the way these LNG projects that are being talked about here are shaping up, the Japanese are kind of the midwives to the LNG industry. They're the ones who, in order to jumpstart the LNG in Qatar more than 25 years ago, they basically said, energy security is so important to us that we are prepared to guarantee we will buy, X volumes of, if you'll produce LNG, we will buy X volumes of it for 25 years, take or pay, at what by anybody's estimates were very, very generous prices. They were prepared to pay a premium to guarantee a certain level of gas supply. And, gas prices are higher in Asia anyway, and so the Japanese made a sort of strategic decision. They were prepared to pay a premium in return for more security of supply. And that's where the basic model of the take-or-pay contract gets started, okay? Now, as I say, there is more and more LNG that's starting to be available outside of take-or-pay contracts for spot transactions, but even the spot prices for LNG in Asia are significantly higher than they are anywhere else in the world. And so, if you're a U.S. shale gas producer and you're looking at doing a shale gas LNG project, you're going to want the highest margins you can get. And, the Japanese are working very hard at trying to court American shale producers, get them signed up for LNG projects. And, their government is working very hard in Washington trying to get as many export licenses approved so they can have as much American LNG as possible coming to Japan. And so, I think it's just, I think it's very difficult for the U.S. government to tell a private company, you can't go out and sell to a U.S. ally because we'd rather have you sell to another U.S. ally for less money. I don't think that conversation's going to go real well.
It seems like all we ever hear about is Iran wants to get atomic bombs and they want to blow up Israel. Is there any, what else do they want? I mean, you're negotiating.
Well,
You must want
first
something
of all,
than that.
let me take a little bit of issue with the premise that is what they want, and then talk about what else they want. Yeah. I don't believe that Iran wants a nuclear weapon. I think they want what you might call a nuclear option in the way that Japan, Canada, a bunch of other countries have nuclear options. I don't think they want to go all the way to weaponization. I first went to work for the US government in 1992. Got my first security clearances then. And since then, since 1992, I've been hearing from US sources, from Israeli sources, Iran is 3 to 5 years away from having a nuclear weapon. Okay? And each year, it's still 3 to 5 years, we just keep resetting it ad infinitum. Now, maybe you want to argue that the Iranians are just incompetent. I personally don't believe that. I think there's a reason they have not, taken advantage of this 3 to 5 years and, gotten to a nuclear weapon. I think there is actually a critical mass of both elite opinion in Iran and, according to decent polls, public opinion, that by and large, Iranians think they would be worse off in terms of their security with a nuclear weapon than without. There is also a religious dimension. Both Imam Khomeini and the current Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, have said publicly on multiple occasions, invoking their religious authority, that nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction are haram. They are forbidden by God. It is sinful to have them. And that is the kind of vocabulary that is used. Now, you could say that is all just talk, but there is a really interesting precedent where the Iranians walked the walk on this. During the Iran-Iraq War, a war of aggression launched by Saddam Hussein, Saddam began using chemical weapons against Iranian targets, not just military targets, but civilian targets. Iraqi officials admitted after the war that Iraqi forces used more than 100,000 chemical munitions against Iran during the war. The Iranians began to complain about this in 1983. They went to the UN Security Council. And the United States, I have to say, my view, to its dishonor, systematically blocked the Security Council from considering the Iranian complaints. The UN Secretary General at the time, Mr. Perez de Cuellar, on his own authority, he sent, over a 2-year period, he sent 6 inspection teams to investigate the Iranian claims. Every time, the inspectors came back and said, yes, the Iranians are right about this. The Iraqis are using CW, including against civilian targets as well as military targets. And the US blocked any action by the Security Council. I've got George Shultz on the record in my book saying, well, we didn't want the Iranians to win the war. Quote. And while this was going on, and over the course of the war, more than 100,000 Iranians were victims of chemical weapons attack. If you go to Tehran today, every day, there's some Iranian who dies as a consequence of CW exposure in the Iran-Iraq War. While this was going on, Iranian military leaders came to Imam Khomeini and said, look, we inherited from the Shah the infrastructure we need to mass produce chemical weapons agent and to weaponize this. We need to be able to do this to retaliate in kind. And in the middle of a war, while Iranians are being victimized by chemical weapons, Imam Khomeini says no. This would be a violation of God's law. The Islamic Republic of Iran will not do this. And they didn't do it. Now, with all of that, you could, in theory, get another supreme leader at some point who has a different theological read about these issues. But I think it's going to be hard for Ayatollah Khamenei or for any future leader in Iran simply to come out one day and say, and this is a system that legitimates itself in no small part on the basis of its perceived adherence to Islamic law. It's going to be really hard for Khamenei or his successor to come out and say, you know all that stuff we told you about nuclear weapons being haram and being sinful, and we wouldn't retaliate with CW during the Iran-Iraq War, all that stuff. Never mind. I think that's going to be really hard to pull off. I think the Iranians want a nuclear option. They want a civil nuclear program. If it gives them a weapons option and people perceive it that way, that's not unhelpful. And the fact that they do this, that they've gone from 0 to 2,000 centrifuges to 19,000 centrifuges in defiance of the United States, in defiance of Israel. In terms of public opinion, soft power in the Islamic world, that's huge. Public opinion polls in the Arab world, in Sunni Arab countries, will show you that roughly two-thirds of Sunni Arabs think that Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon. 3/4 of them think it will be a good thing if Iran succeeds at that. That's soft power. Thanks.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. I'm noticing that you didn't mention windmills or solar panels about energy. How many hundreds of thousands of them do you think are going to be built in the next 3 years?
I think you will see orders of magnitude growth in windmills, solar, all these things. But you're starting from such low baselines. If you look at the projections by the International Energy Agency, if you look at the projections by the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration, if you look at projections by big energy companies, Total, ExxonMobil, so forth, we're right now, hydrocarbons provide about 81% of the global energy balance. Project out 20 or 25 years, and even with orders of magnitude growth in the use of things like solar panels, if you go out 20 or 25 years, you're still talking about hydrocarbons providing, say, 75% of the world's energy.
You think the hydrocarbons will go on forever?
I won't say forever. Forever is an awfully long time. I think, for the remainder of my lifetime, hydrocarbons are still going to provide the overwhelming majority of the world's energy. And obviously, I won't be around. Sorry?
It keeps being manufactured underground.
Well, that's
Eventually going to run out.
I think that, yes, eventually it will run out, but the Saudi energy minister has a wonderful line about this. He says, the Stone Age didn't end because the world ran out of stone. Okay? And the oil age is not going to end because the world runs out of oil. It's going to end because we find something better to do. I just think that's a long, long way off.